Please introduce yourself so everyone knows who's asking, actually.
Chico Ferreira from the World Bank. A question for Georg. I was worrying a little bit about non-robot capital in your paper. You know, in your model, there's basically two factors. So there's robots and labor, which would not be a problem, presumably, if there was if capital, if they were perfectly substitutes, right? If capital and robots, other capital and robots are perfect substitutes. But presumably they're not perfect substitutes. Presumably there's a missing parameter there, which is the elasticity of substitution between other forms of capital, say computers and ICT and robots. And so now that doesn't matter so much in the theory. I mean, for a theory, you'd like to have three factors if you're talking about robots as separate from other forms of capital. But I was then worried whether that had any implications for your empirics, in the sense that, for example, the validity of the instrument might depend on whether you'd fully and flexibly controlled for other forms of capital in both the first and the second stage. So just a general question about the treatment of non-robotic capital in your paper. Thanks.
We'll try to collect. If there are more, let's collect, let's say, 3, and then we'll answer in batches.
Andrea Salvatori from the University of Essex. I have 2 questions, one for each of the speakers, if that's okay. Yeah? Okay, so on the robots paper, I was just wondering, so you used, as an instrument, you used the, if I understand correctly, the occupational composition of industries in the US at the beginning of some time period. That seems to suggest that basically the way, well, the degree to which different occupations were automized is exogenous, doesn't have anything to do with the industries in which these occupations were concentrated. I'm not sure, so I have to confess I didn't really understand all the robustness checks that you showed, so maybe you have addressed this, but my point is basically that the extent to which an occupation was subsequently automized might depend on the industry's characteristics in which it was initially concentrated. So I wouldn't see that as entirely exogenous. And John, thank you for your interesting presentation as well. I was very struck by the graph that you showed at the end about the contribution to polarization of atypical employment, but you said, I think, that you interpret that as showing that changes in regulations, and so, namely, that the regulation of the labor market has contributed to polarization. I'm not sure I understood the mechanism that you're suggesting there. One immediate objection to that would be that it's, you know, technology is driving everything. It's the new jobs that are polarized, not the old ones, and the new jobs tend to be found, you know, filled with atypical contracts. So this wouldn't be caused by the regulation. It's simply that at the time when we have polarization driven by technology, you know, these atypical contracts are available and are used for the new jobs.
Yeah, please.
Right. So on the question of non-robot capital, yeah, we agree. It's an incredibly important issue. So we do have robustness checks where we put also non-robot capital on the right-hand side, and we have the breakdown into ICT and non-ICT equipment. Basically, that's what we put on the right-hand side in both the OLS and the IV, and the results are robust to that. And in terms of the theory, yes, there are simple ways of also putting it in there, but you know, it would sort of complicate and maybe detract a little bit from the main message. The question about various elasticities of substitutions, I don't think we can credibly estimate all of these, given the data that we or anyone has. I mean, but that's. Maybe we can talk about that afterwards. I'm not convinced that it's usually possible to estimate these elasticities. And another thing that's going on here as well is that there's a change in the production function, because so many of these industries just aren't using any robots at the beginning, and it seems sensible to think of this as a change in the production function. And then again, the idea of estimating elasticity is probably is not appropriate in this context. But the basic message is controlling for non-robot capital results are robust. Question on exogeneity of sort of what kind of tasks get automated. I mean, in principle, I agree that could be a concern. So, you say there is an industry that is has fast productivity growth, and robot suppliers look at, okay, what are the tasks in that industry, because I want to be a supplier for this industry. So then what we look at is the falsification exercise that I showed is, okay, so is there any relationship between this instrument and changes in the outcomes that we look at before there were robots? And we don't find any relationship. So I think that's reassuring. I don't think we can sort of rule out this concern with 100% certainty, but I think the falsification exercise is reassuring.
To Andrea's question, what's the mechanism behind, in this description of non-standard employment and standard employment, their shifts and the fact that they differ quite notably? What's the mechanism we're alleging? Well, there isn't really a mechanism in the sense that this is descriptive data. We're trying to describe what we observe, and we have in the past tried to model some of these changes in a more multivariate way, with some effort to model the respective contributions of technological factors, trade factors, and institutional factors, and we found the whole exercise deeply difficult, and we weren't able to generate really a lot of very significant results. So I would say that it's still a hunch based on the descriptive data, but what I would say is that that chart just covers 3 years of data. We've also shown, we can show data going back to 1995 where you see very, very similar patterns at the aggregate EU level. You see a contribution of atypical employment, a very strong contribution at the top and the bottom of the wage distribution, and you see increasingly well, not increasingly, you see consistently over time that employment growth in the top quintile, standard employment tends to be more upgrading, tends to be very strongly skewed towards the top quintile. And it's the consistency over time that gives us some feeling that this might be, that there may be some institutional or policy-based parameters which are affecting the employment structure over and above the traditional technological determinants. Maybe there's some form of mediation, as you suggest. I'm not sure. It's work to be done.
Thank you, Leszek Kąsek from the Warsaw office of the World Bank. I'm impressed by the quality, the richness of this session, so I'm glad I'm here. Thank you. Well, first, I may give you a hint on the last slide you showed. Especially the problem is on the left side, the increase on atypical contracts of low skilled. This is Poland. This is the last 3 years. I think it explains the majority of this bar. So this is one. I would like to ask all of you if you see something like an optimal solution or a balance between in the use application of robots or automate this technology in general. Because I'm not researching this field, but I have a feeling, and this is also based on my private observation of my son after playing the Angry Birds, that at some point the productivity may go down actually because of distraction. Look how many toys you have in your bags, and at some points, yours rang when you were presenting. Okay, you did a great job, but still. There's some source of distraction. I don't know if all this technology of this is really a productivity enhancing. At some point, maybe there is there is a well, it hampers productivity. I'd like to hear from you whether is there's any supportive research, empirics on that.
Do you want to try or should I do it?
Can I respond? Well, my weapon of mass distraction went off to tell me to finish my presentation, so it was actually producing it was a very productivity enhancing intervention by my phone. So maybe George is better placed to answer the substantive question.
Not really. So this is far outside questions I look at, but in general, I do believe a lot in revealed preference, and people use the technology the way they like it to use. So I don't necessarily see a problem there. There's also, the power of competition.
Please turn it on.
Okay, so should we start from the beginning?
Now let's see how technology is useful.
I don't necessarily think there's a big problem. I mean, there's always some adjustment, when there's new technologies, the optimal use. Maybe it takes some time to figure it out. But in terms of consumer products, I'm very optimistic.
And we actually, also managed. So outside where we have printed papers, there is actually a policy paper by Maciej Jakubowski, which we released last year, about using computers at schools, which somehow relates to your question. And indeed, there are research-based findings that the way we use computers is not always conducive to improving productivity, be it how we work, because we tend to engage in multitasking, and we actually overestimate our ability to do that. We tend to engage into very intense task switching when we have the opportunity, and we tend to dive into never-ending pool of the next link on when we are online, and also when in the computer use there are at schools, for example, in teaching, there are findings that it's actually as a tool is not that useful if you just use it to replace the old school methods of teaching, but it can be very useful if you adapt the methods of teaching to the tool you have. So I think that basically everything has a learning curve. And we are at the moment when we see that the ICT just gets spread out into various areas of life. And probably if you were sitting here like 1950s and ask about the widespread proliferation of television, that a lot of people would also argue that it's going to decrease our productivity soon because we will have more distractions and whatever. Somehow as a, let's say, human race, we learn to cope with that. So I think that we will see a learning curve also in the way how we deal with all these distractions. I don't know how about you, but I have reduced many of the bad habits I learned initially when having that tool. So I think
maybe it's the other way around. It's just a reflection of productivity. You can distract yourself because you have time to do it.
yes. There is also this discussion about, for example, if companies are right to ban Facebook use at the workplace, because someone once estimated the number of hours spent by British employers on Facebook while at the office. I mean, it's huge, the number of hours. But then the counter-argument is that they would waste that time anyway, just differently. They would smoke more cigarettes outside. So, I think we're on a learning curve.
Maybe. Hi, this is Omar Arias from the World Bank. So maybe picking up on this conversation. So on this question of the impact of these technologies, and by the way, I think on the first presentation, I'm still a little intrigued by the distinction between robots and digital technologies. I think that's kind of a very difficult distinction to make. I mean, even when you just do something on the web these days, you're asked to type a text to make sure you're not a robot. So even the algorithms are called robots. But so part of the debate in the US is that, so far the productivity impacts are not quite seen in the data, right? So the trends in productivity, when you look long term, are not great. I was in a seminar where they brought David Autor, the authors of the Second Machine Age book, Larry Summers, and a few other experts to debate this. And I thought, I think from your model, there is an interesting explanation, and an example that I heard from Larry Summers, I think is very illuminating. So a lot of the issue actually has to do with the fact that you may see innovation in an industry, but the spillover of that innovation to other sectors depends a lot on, as you said in the model, price and income elasticities. The example he gives is, the industry of illumination, lighting, basically. So he says there has been enormous improvements in sort of the efficiency of lighting, but because of the nature of demand, it's not leading people to consume more light bulbs, right? And you wouldn't expect that to be the case. It's just going to be declining prices, so you can buy cheaply, but you're not going to consume significantly more. Second, you're not going to see a lot of spillovers into other sectors because, it's a very minor input in the production function. So the two things, demand and sort of, related to how these sectors interact with production, suggests that you won't see a lot in the data unless these technologies become sort of general purpose. So I think that's something also to consider.
I'm not sure what to say because I agree. I mean, it's very good points in terms of general purpose technologies. I do think that what we're seeing are general purpose technologies, and in particular when it comes to building machines that can emulate more and more of what humans can do, not just in terms of cognitive skills, but also in terms of physical skills. So in that sense, I think there is some ground for optimism.
Okay, thank you very much.